Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special video. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the story of how I almost won a Black Lotus. As I'm sure you are aware, Black Lotus is the creme de la creme of Magic the Gathering cards, and the copy I was competing for was an unlimited Black Lotus worth around $10,000, which is not the high range for Black Lotus, but is still a heck of a lot for a Magic card, and such a cool one at that. So I did want to do well in this event, and I would have prepared religiously, except for the fact that this was a very special event known as a pre-release. That is right, this was the Black Lotus pre-release that took place at the MTG Summit in Salt Lake City. So this was the first time that many players had been even seen the physical cards. Now, of course, we see the full spoiler a week in advance, and I had the special advantage of being a content creator and getting to play in the early access event. So I had real gameplay experience with the cards that my competitors simply lacked. So I was hoping to leverage that to place quite well in this event. Now, I'm going to go a little bit over how the day ended up unfolding. I arrived in Salt Lake City on the Friday afternoon, saw the sights a little bit, walked around the town, which, by the way, is absolutely stunning. There's just some really nice buildings and things like that in Salt Lake City. I checked out the Tabernacle that they were having a Veterans Day concert in, because this was a tournament that took place over the Veterans Day weekend, and overall, it was just really nice getting kind of a little bit settled in Salt Lake City, which, by the way, was super cold. Like, it's frigid in Salt Lake City, even in early November, which obviously a lot of places are cold in November, but I'm from California, and California never really gets that cold, so, I'm not necessarily used to the climate, but cold weather, let's go. And I arrived Friday night, and wanted to make sure I was well rested for the tournament ahead. Arrived next day in the convention center bright and early, and got ready for deck registration, which, if you've never done it before, it's actually kind of a fun process. Like, I enjoy it, a lot of people don't, but basically you have to open your packs, make sure that people aren't cheating by putting extra rares into their packs, and then you register every single card. And deck registration was a little bit tough for me for a couple of reasons. For starters, the way that the pool went really was stressing me out, because in sealed, which this was a sealed tournament primarily, you never really have full control over the cards you are dealt. So for instance, I opened this pre-release pack, which is what they were using for these sealed pools, and the first card that I saw was my pre-release promo, which was the Stone Brain, which really is not a card that you're hoping to see in your really high stakes limited event. The next card that I opened, though, obviously, I was hoping for better, and I got a Brush Land. So also not great. You don't really want those non-basic lands, but I kept that trend up. The third rare I saw in the second pack I opened was Mishra's Factory. So it really didn't get off to an auspicious start, but I ended up cobbling together some excellent rares in my future packs. I got the Thran Spider, I got an Ashnod, I got a Jixian Infiltrator, and then I finally got Cityscape Leveler, which ends up being a very key part of my deck. It was also kind of funny because the person registering my card pool was dyslexic, which makes it really hard because you kind of have to sort through alphabetically, identify all the cards, and if you can't really see the letters because it's jumbled, that's a little bit of a tricky thing. So the judge had to come help them. I ended up being a little bit more time crunched building my deck, but I felt very happy with how I did. That being said, I'm showing this is my deck list that I ended up building, and there was a key weakness that was in my pool, in addition to a couple of dud rares, which everyone's going to have. I had some pretty good rares, but the key weakness was my pool had basically no removal, and you'll see that I was splashing a Prison Sentence, which isn't really what I wanted to do because I had no other real reason to splash white, other than the fact that my only removal in my main two colors was Shoot Down and then Cityscape Leveler, which, if I'm casting my 8-drop Mythic Rare, I'm probably in good shape, and I'd rather have a couple of removal spells to deal with my opponent's stuff. So that was a weakness of my deck, and it was something that I was really worried about going into the rounds. But that was my deck. I got things, and I was pretty happy because I had a little bit of top end, and I had a lot of prototype creatures, which are great for playing in the mid games and then casting late if the sealed game goes long, which sealed often does. So that was the deck list, and I was getting ready for the tournament itself, sleeved up, ready to go. Now, before diving into the rounds, I do want to say that I kept detailed notes on what I was up against, partially as an aid for sideboarding and strategical things within the match, but also because it's kind of helpful to have all the cards that you faced in a little notebook and how the games ended up going. But I'm not going to bore you with all of the details of every individual game. Rather, I will tell you which rares from my opponents I had to overcome in order to be victorious in the rounds, because that's going to be more fun, and it's just a nice way to kind of classify the sorts of decks that I was up against. Before getting to the round by round, though, I do want to say that this tournament had a very ambiguous, shall we say, tournament structure. I didn't really know how it worked before going in. Well, nobody else really did either. And so I just went in with the mindset, I've got to win as many matches as possible. I didn't really have a clear, like, okay, this is what I need to do to get to the top 8. This is what I need to do to like win the whole event. You just have to win. And that's the only thing you really can control. It turned out that I needed to get to a X and 2 record. So however many wins plus 2 or less losses in order to make it through to the second day of competition, which was something that I generally figured because that's how it often worked at Grand Prix, which this tournament kind of felt like a Grand Prix. Anyway, getting into round 1, I played against an opponent who had a stacked deck right off the bat. Some of the rares, they had Blade Coil Serpent, they had Mishra, and they had a Cityscape Leveler of their own, which in Game 2 actually really hosed me because my Cityscape Leveler gave them the Power Stone tokens that they needed to cast their Cityscape Leveler, which ended up costing me the game. So I won a tight 3-game match in round 1, which really set the stage for the entire day. In round 2, I came up against another opponent who had a Phyrexian Processor, which again was kind of a card that could really hose me if I didn't happen to draw my singleton copy of Shoot Down, because I just didn't have any real interaction that could destroy a Phyrexian Processor. So I just had to kind of get fortunate to defeat that card. My opponent also had a Mishra, albeit a different Mishra, and then they had a large 6-drop dragon, which I think is one of the best rares in the set. So that was another tight round, but luckily I think my opponent misconstructed their deck in other ways that allowed me to have an edge in the matchup and ultimately win in a convincing 2 games. The next round I played against a opponent who was a little bit out of it. It felt like they were eating their food while we were playing. They were a really nice guy, and they had some really strong cards as well. They had a Precursor Golem, which is a very, very hard card to beat if you don't happen to draw your copy of Shoot Down to destroy all of the Precursor Golems, as I did. They also had a Surge Engine, which I was luckily able to prison sentence, and they also had a Draconic Destiny, which led to one of the funnier plays in the tournament, where I had a Boulder Branch Golem in my hand with 6 mana, and I decided, you know, I'm going to draw a land soon. I'm just going to wait a turn and try to cast the Boulder Branch as a 7-drop. That meant that I just passed my turn without doing anything with like 2 cards in hand, and my opponent, who had their Draconic Destiny in their hand, ended up doing nothing on their turn as well because they didn't want to run it into removal, because obviously they didn't know that my deck had no removal. Proceed to the next turn where I top deck my Gix's Caress to take their Draconic Destiny from their hand, and they proceed to be like, oh my gosh, did you not have anything? Was that a sick bluff? What was going on? And they ended up getting a little bit punished for their prudent decision not to cast their spell into 6 open mana, which ended up being a pretty funny way. But I won that in a convincing 2 games as well. Next round also won that in 2 games, which ended up going pretty well. My opponent actually didn't have any crazy cards. They were just playing some general creatures. I didn't actually see any crazy rares from them, and so that one was relatively easy to win with my strong rares. The next round was the first time that I really had a struggle, because it was the first time that I lost a game 1 in the tournament, and that's always like, okay, I've got to battle back. And my opponent was relatively aggressive, which was also like not something I was hugely worried about because I had some good 2-drops, especially with Death Touch, so I was going to be able to fend them off, but I also had the ability to have a kind of slow start sometimes, and so I was a little bit worried going into games 2 and 3, but luckily in game 2, I was able to pull it out. At 4 life, I stabilized, and little beknownst to me, though I did know they could have burned, they had the 6-drop dragon in their deck that if they had drawn it, it would have killed me with its 4 damage. And then in the final game, my opponent got super flooded, and despite the fact that they had like 10 mana in play by turn like 5 or something, because they had like a Burnished Heart and things like that, I was able to take them down. Now, if you've been keeping track of the way my record is going, you'll notice that I'm 5-0. I'm undefeated at this point in the tournament, and I'm doing quite well. My deck is performing on all cylinders, but there's also the danger, because as you advance through the tournament, the decks you face get better and better. And the fact that my deck had no removal meant that my opponents were going to have more and more strong rares that I was going to have to answer, and I didn't have the answers to those rares. There was nothing I really could do on that front. So I'm getting a little bit nervous, but that didn't stop me from taking absolute pleasure in the fact that I got chosen for a feature match. Now, I made a whole video breaking down my feature match, but suffice to say, my opponent had an amazing deck. They had a bunch of removal. They had a bunch of great rares. They had 2 Steel Seraphs. in fact, which is a rare that's really bad for my deck to see, because I can't even really prison sentence that because they're just going to keep giving all their stuff abilities. And so I really only have shoot down as an answer. And even that's like only can take care of one of the steel seraphs. So I actually sided in the stone brain against my opponent, which was not something I had expected to do throughout the day, but I never drew it. And I ended up winning a close 3 games, lost the first game in a very close one where I got my opponent to 1, won the second game thanks to Cityscape Leveler, and then my opponent got mana screwed in game 3, and I was able to take them down. So I'm 6-0. I'm locked for the second day of competition, and there's 2 rounds to go on day 1, and I just want to get as many wins as I can. Now, I get paired up in what will turn out to be a fateful matchup for me in the 7th round against a wonderful guy called David Chen. He was very nice, really fun to play against. There was actually a lot of really nice people that I played against, but David, as you will see, I became quite familiar playing against David, and a little bit of foreshadowing there, but I played against David Chen, and his deck was absolutely fantastic, and it had all of the stuff that I really didn't want to see, because he had creatures that I could not permanently remove that had abilities when they were in play that made them absolutely miserable to go up against. His deck had tons of removal. He had a Myral, which was an absolutely fantastic card in his deck, especially when it was paired with Yoshin Dissident, which is a card that I was lucky not to face a lot of during the tournament, because as I said, I have no way to get rid of it, and it just takes me down over the course of these games where he's just making tons of tokens. He would attack with Myral, he'd have a couple scrapwork cohorts having been deployed, he would just have millions of creatures in play, and he'd just make more artifacts, and he actually killed me in 1 attack from all the way at 19 life in game 1. Where I'd been plinking him away, I got him all the way down to 3. But unfortunately, I lost that game. I lost the match. His deck just had a bunch of cards that I couldn't really deal with. He also had a Gwenna. He had a Simian Simulacrum. He also had a Steel Seraph that he just showed me for the lols after the match. Like, yeah, I had this in my deck that I never drew. So basically, what you'd kind of expect from a 6-0 deck. His deck just had all these great on-color rares and tons of removal and a pretty good mana base for his little 3 colors because he was splashing a little bit. And overall, I was like, oh gosh, well, I was going to face that eventually, but I'm 6-1. I'm still in good shape. I'm going into the final round of day 1, and I'd really like to end on a high note. Not that a 6-2 finish wouldn't be a high note, but ending with a win is always nice. And I got paired up against an opponent who was a very nice guy, but there was a little bit of sourness that happened over the course of the game. And it all stemmed from the fact that I called the judge on them for them making a gameplay violation. Now, this is not something that has to be taken personally. It's something that a lot of players are like, okay, I made the mistake. But basically what happened was he was getting a little bit color screwed. He only had red mana, and he tried to cast Raise to the Ground at instant speed on my card. And when this happens, you're supposed to call a judge, and the judge will come over. They'll give the person a warning very politely. And if that person hasn't done any other big gameplay violations over the course of the day, everything will be fine. They'll just have a little warning to be more careful for next time. Now, it was a pre-release event. A lot of people had never played with the cards before, so I didn't expect my opponent to be doing it maliciously, but it's still the sort of thing that you do because I have a very small experience with my opponent. If my opponent is doing this against someone who's less experienced, maybe they don't catch them trying to cast their sorcery at instant speed. And maybe my opponent's the sort of person that would do that in every single game just to do a little bit of a check on their opponent. And if you never call a judge, they're never going to get called for it, and they're just going to be able to continue doing so. However, when I called the judge, my opponent got really defensive. They thought I was basically accusing them of cheating, and that's the sort of thing that I just had to hold my ground and call the judge over because that's just what you're supposed to do. And if you're ever playing in these sorts of events and someone calls a judge on you, don't take it personally, and you should feel free to call the judge and tell them what your opponent has done wrong as well. I've had judges called on me. I've had accidentally drawn 2 cards from the top of my deck instead of 1. These sorts of things happen, but that's just the sort of thing that happens. And I beat them in game 1, and then in game 2, I don't want to talk too much about how I dunked on people with random uncommons, but it was super funny because they played a couple of 1 toughness creatures, and then they played a mass production at the top end, and I happened to have my Gruesome Realization in my hand, and I killed 6 creatures with it or something insane, and that was game 2. So I ended day 1 7-1. Now, in addition to playing all of these matches, it was really fun being at the event, meeting some folks, and interacting with some folks that have watched my channel, like you folks. It was really, really cool, and a bunch of people came up to me over the course of the day. We chatted a little bit and things like that. And over the course of the day, there was one person that I had talked to a decent amount because they were also doing very well in the event. Their name was Alan, and he was always kind of at the top table, like at the diagonal, because the way it works is you're paired up against the people, but if there's people at the top tables, you end up seeing them a lot. And so I had talked with Alan a decent amount over the course of the day, and I ended up getting dinner with Alan and some of his people that he knew that were at the event. A lot of them were from Denver, so shout out to the Denver Magic scene. It was really great to meet a bunch of those folks over dinner, and ending up the day 7-1, getting ready for day 2, and having a nice relaxing meal at the end of the day was really awesome. So I was ready, I was geared up, and this is where I will tell you a little bit about the peculiarities of this tournament, because generally speaking, this is the sort of event where you would play day 1, and then day 2 you would do some drafts, and the drafts would give you a completely new deck. It would be against all the people that had advanced, so it's a generally smaller field, so they have the ability to facilitate these drafts. But this was a smaller event. This was a group of people organizing the event that had never really organized a big event before, and organizing drafts is very difficult, especially in a pre-release environment where packs maybe aren't as accessible. I don't really know all the details, but basically late in day 1, I found out that day 2 was going to be sealed with the exact same deck that I had day 1. Now, this was kind of problematic for me because I felt like my deck was on the lower end of the spectrum of decks that could qualify for day 2 because I had played quite well, and I just knew that I didn't have removal spells and that I had like my key top end rare like Cityscape Leveler. Like, I'm not complaining, that card's insane, but I know that I'd played against some people that had pretty crazy decks and I wanted to do really well, and I felt like giving myself a shot in drafting was going to be better for me. But same deck on day 2, which did lead to some crazy scenarios. There's also another aspect of the event where on day 2 you play 4 more rounds, and then there's a cut to top 16 where you play 1 more round, and then if you win that round, you're in the top 8. So really kind of crazy how that breaks down, because if you are like undefeated the entire tournament and then you get into the top 16 and you lose 1 round, even if you've won every other match, it doesn't matter. You don't get to make top 8 and do a draft. So it's really crazy. And spoiler alert, there was somebody in this tournament, namely a notable pro that I'm a big fan of called Sam Black, who had that exact thing happen to him where he was undefeated. He had not lost a single match. He was so dominant that he got to draw intentionally his last 2 rounds to guarantee he made it into the top 16, and then the only loss he had was in the top 16, or so he didn't make the top 8. So that's a little bit of a preview of how that ended up going, but absolutely crazy that you could win every single match and then it just kind of doesn't even let you get to the top 8, which is kind of unfortunate. Everyone has the same constraints, obviously, so it's not like unfair per se, but it just feels a little bit bad. So that was one of the oddities of the tournament, and something that a lot of players were a little bit confused about, myself included, because you just never expected. Like, I just like went into day 2, and towards the end of day 1 I was like asking people, and they were like, yeah, we're using the same decks. I was like, okay, I guess that's how it's going to go. But back to the story. Day 2 starts off, I played against the nicest guy. He offered me a Slim Jim when I sat down. I had actually interacted with him a little bit before because he was the person sitting next to me in my final round of day 1, and he told me that he told me that he ended up playing against the later he chased me down and told me that the guy that I called the judge on tried to also cast the sorcery at instant speed against him, and he had to call the judge on him too. So that's why you have to call the judge, so people can try to not do the same things over and over. But back to the match. I played against this guy, nicest dude ever, and in game 1 he actually played some crazy cards. He played Visions of Phyrexia, which was drawing him an extra card every turn. He played Sundering Titan and happened to blow up 3 of my lands, which was absolutely crazy, and he was going to blow up 3 more of my lands because I happened to draw both of my planes that game, which was super bad for me, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm just going to lose to a Sundering Titan. This is insane. And what ended up happening was I was able to get a couple of Rust Goliath in play and a couple of other big creatures, and he ended up decking because he was just casting so many cards. He had so many Power Stone tokens, but he wasn't able to force through that damage, and I felt like I was like, oh no, I'm going to lose because he's just going to play some removal spells, but he wasn't able to get rid of my big creatures, so I was able to win game 1, and then game 2 he got mana screwed, and he had an aggressive start, but it petered out because he couldn't cast his spells, and I was able to stabilize at 4 life and win the game. So I was 8-1 now. I realistically need 1 more win in order to make it into the top 16 cut, and that is when calamity occurred, because due to the nature of the tournament, I got paired once more against David Chen. Now, you might be scratching your head, who's David Chen again? Oh yes, David Chen is the only person that I have lost to in this tournament. I'm currently X'd Chen, as I like to put it. And the weird oddity of the tournament is that normally day 2 getting paired against the same person doesn't matter because you've drafted a completely different deck. But in this case, I knew basically every card in his deck. I had played against him. I had seen so much of it. We played a game where one of us almost decked or some crazy amount. It was a crazy situation where I knew basically every card in his deck, and I knew that I basically had no chance of winning. And so we play our match, and despite the fact that he is not even focused, he's not really paying attention, he ends up defeating me. When I say he's not paying attention, he played a Scrapwork Rager from his graveyard and forgot to draw the card because he had so many other triggers, and he just missed drawing a card, and it didn't even matter because I flooded a little bit in one of the games, and he ended up just defeating me. Also, a weird side note about the tournament, because it was the same decks over times, he had actually gotten a game loss, which had cost him the match that he had played, because he had taken his cards home with him, and overnight, the cards that he hadn't sleeved, because they were in his sideboard, had like curled slightly, and that ended up making it so that when he sideboarded, the judges said that his cards were marked, which meant that when he was playing against me, instead of having real cards from the sideboard, he had judges draw right on cards, like basic islands, all of the cards that were in his sideboard, on, like with Sharpie. And then he would like put the real card on top of it once he actually cast it to be like, yeah, this is what the card is. But he had lost the game because of that. So I ended up playing him again, partially because the tournament structure made it so that he had to bring his cards with him overnight, so that they then curled a little bit, so that then he got a card marking violation to lose in the feature match area. And yeah, it was absolutely insane that I got paired against him twice in one day. I told the judges about that. Like, yeah, it's a whole new day, but it's like, yeah, it's the same decks. And we had a bit of a laugh about it. He was a really nice guy. So losing to him twice, X and Chen, as I liked to say it. And so then I was 8-2, and I still needed like one win to get into this top 16. And that is when a crazy series of events ended up happening. For starters, I sat down across from my opponent, and it was none other than Sam Rolfe, who, if you've never heard of him, he's like a pro Magic player. He was in the Rivals League, so he's played in a lot of big events. He's a very skilled Magic the Gathering player. And to make things even crazier, I was in one of the top tables still, and so they asked us if we wanted to have a feature match, and I loved having my first feature match, and so I was one of the backups this time, so I didn't actually get it on camera, but I like being a feature match. So we were all going to move over to the other end of the room where the feature match would take place. But I had actually left my deck at the other table, which somehow I didn't put it back into my backpack, which is absolutely insane. Like, I can't even imagine how I could have not put my deck box back into my backpack. But I had lost my deck, so I was frantically looking through my backpack, looking for my deck. And then they said, and I'd already taken out my playmat and stuff, and then they said, oh, we need to move across the room. And so I'm just like, oh no, I don't have my deck. I'm 8-2. If I win this round, I could be in the top 16. I need to find my deck. So what ended up happening was I go back to the table I was at. My deck isn't there. I'm like, oh no. I go to the judges table. I'm like, guys, I lost my deck. I don't know where it is. And they say, oh, they might have taken it over to the feature match area, because maybe they found it and they brought it over there, like lost and found or whatever, which was near the feature match. I have grabbed my stuff. I walk over, and they're kind of like waiting, getting their feature match stuff set up. I walk over. I'm like, yeah, do you guys have my deck? And they say, no, but the head judge just went back the other way with a deck that they found. And so then I'm like going back to the table. I'm going back and forth. I find a judge. I'm like, okay, judge, I can't find my deck. I think that this judge has it. They think it said something. And the judge that walks over, it's the head judge for the whole event. You can tell, like, the head judges have like a burgundy shirt on, and he has his hands behind his back, and he says, what does your deck box look like? And I was like, it has Ugin on it. It's a deck box that has Ugin on it. And he pulls it out and he has my deck. And what ended up happening was he found my deck on the table. And he took the deck over to the feature match area, right as I was basically going to go check the table where I had left my deck box. And then as I was going back over to the feature match area to look for my deck, he was bringing it back to the judges table where I had just been. So we probably like walked right past each other. And it was like a whole crazy thing. And after all of this, after all this tension, after I've almost lost my deck and almost just lost the round and lost the whole tournament, I then had to sit down and face off against Sam Rolfe, who is a true competitor, a really skilled Magic player. I mean, he's played in all these huge events, and he also had a sick deck. He had Thran Spider. He had Scrap Trawler, which I opened a Scrap Trawler, and it wasn't particularly good with the cards I had. It was really good with the cards he had. He had a Mishra's Bauble. He had a Mishra's Research Desk, which are really cheap artifacts that he could get back anytime any of his cards died. He had Saheeli, which is just an insane card to deal with, especially because my deck had basically no removal that could deal with planeswalkers. And then he had the Brotherhood's End, he had a Drafna, he had a Skystrike Officer, so basically just billions of on-colors rares, and he also had tons of good removal to boot, and he even had the NicolaiBolas preview card, Spotterthopter, which was the first time that I faced it, and only time that I faced it in the entire tournament, which is pretty funny, but that's the way it goes. But seeing my preview card in action, I did insert the little flex, like, oh, that's my preview card, and then he was like, oh, you create content. That's my imitation of his Welsh accent that I'm not going to do justice to, so I'm just going to use it that one time, but really nice guy. Yeah, I play against him, lose game 1 convincingly because he just overwhelms me with value, and then game 2, I actually almost decked him because he was drawing so many cards with his Saheeli. He got a Saheeli Ultimate before I could find my Cityscape Leveler to finally get it off the board, and then I wasn't able to deck him because he was able to make an Alpha Strike because he was able to go too wide to too wide for me to block all of his cards, and killed me with exact damage with his Alpha Strike when he was not that close to decking, honestly, but a little bit close. That was like kind of my path to victory that game. So at this point, I'm 8-3, basically X and Chen plus Rolf. And so I go over to the standings board, and I see that there's pretty much a clear-cut top 16 at this point, where everyone that's in the top 16 is 3 points ahead of the next closest person. I'm like in the next tier of people. So it was like 27 points, 24 points, and like everyone in the top 16 had at least 27. So if they all draw with each other, they're generally going to be pretty safe. There was ended up being a little bit more drama than that, but basically it meant that I wasn't going to be able to make top 16, because the only way I would is if they ended up playing out their matches and somebody lost and I won. I had better tiebreakers, which, to be fair, I had pretty good tiebreakers, because the only people I had lost to were Chen and Rolf, who were at the top of the table, which opponent quality and the people you've lost to really matters in terms of tiebreakers. So I sit down to the final round knowing that I realistically can't make it into the top 16, but I'm going to do my darndest to win this final round, because there's always that off chance. And I lose game one, which losing game one is never a good feeling, because you know you have to claw your way back. And it's even worse when you see like they have a Steel Seraph and you're like, oh no, I can't really beat that card if I don't draw my like one answer to it in my entire deck. And they also have a Fauna Shaman to help them find it. And over the course of them like self-milling some cards, or me milling them, or I forget exactly how I saw, but they have a Siege Veteran, which is another card that I basically can't beat, because I can't even shoot down that card. And if I put Prison Sentence on it, they're still going to get a counter every turn. So that card's basically unbeatable for me, and it's a 3-drop. So I just have to really pray that I don't see that card in games 2 or 3, which ends up happening, because thanks to some cunning plays, I win game 2. And in game 3, they had to mulligan, and I was able to emerge victorious as well, and I won my final round, and ending the tournament at a really, really good, that I'm really happy with, 9-3 record. I checked the standings after the final round, and I just missed the top 16. I came in 18th place in the tournament, which is my best finish ever at one of these high, like, big events, and I was very, very happy with that, because if you can't be happy with 18th place, you're never really going to be happy, because going 9-3 doesn't just happen any day of the week. And so I was very, very pleased, and overall I didn't make it into the top 16, but I was really only 5 wins away from a Black Lotus, which is closer than I've ever been to that sort of thing before, because I needed to get 1 more win to get into the top 16, 1 more win to get into the top 8 from the top 16, and then 3 more wins in the top 8 draft in order to get the Black Lotus. So 5 wins away, not that far. I've rattled off 5 wins in a row plenty of times in my Magic career, and it's pretty cool to just have that happen. But I'm going to tell you how the rest of the tournament went after this, because there was still a lot of fun stuff that went down. Basically, I had some work to do independent of Magic, so I went off to the local library in Salt Lake City, which is also like one of the nicest libraries I've ever been in my entire life. It's like just like a big glass building, just super nice and just insane. It has a glass elevator in a library. I'm like, what is happening? So yeah, Salt Lake City, kudos to your library. So I walked there, and then I walked back. On the way back, got a little bit of a hot chocolate, because, you know, it's freezing in Salt Lake City, even in early November. And then I get back to the venue in time to catch some of the top 8, which was a lot of fun. Now, David Chen had made it to the top 8, who I would have rooted for, but he got knocked out before I got back. He got knocked out in the round of 8. He just said he wasn't feeling very confident in the draft format, because, I mean, who really can? It's a pre-release weekend. And he also got a little bit of unlucky variance with flooding. But regardless of that, I got to watch some of the top 8, and I actually met the person who ended up winning the entire event. Greg, known as Good Guy Greg, was the people's champion. He was super nice. He was talking to the people that were watching, because he was like basically quarantined for a couple of hours due to the fact that you weren't allowed to look at your phone if you were in the top 8, because you could look at the coverage and see what decks people were playing, which meant that he had to sit there in the feature match area waiting while the opponents played this insanely grindy match and didn't have anything to do but talk to the people that were standing there. And so I got to talk to him, and he ended up winning the whole tournament, and he was a great guy. I was hanging out with Alan at that point as well, also, because Alan was also watching the top 8, and overall, it was just a really fun vibe. After the top 8 concluded, I decided to get some dinner, and me and Alan were going to get dinner together, because it's more fun to have dinner with a friend, before I headed off to the airport. And we kind of wandered around the area a little bit before we eventually settled on a spot that wasn't that far away, but was a bit of a trek. And the spot that we went to was like over full, so we weren't able to go there. But the next place next door had the same exact chef, so we ended up going in there. And right as we sat down, good guy Greg, along with a bunch of his other friends, came in. And so we all like said, hey, you want to sit together? And so we ended up sitting together, having a dinner, and it was his celebratory dinner, so it was a lot of fun. One of his friends was Andrew Ellenbogen, who is a Pro Tour champion. He famously defeated LSV in a match that ended up probably leading to the London Mulligan. And another one of his friends was Sam Islandfeld, who is a great Magic player himself, and was Rookie of the Year at one point. So really good gang. There was another guy there whose name I forget, but I remember exactly what he looks like. So don't think you're forgotten that person if you do end up watching this video. But overall, super fun vibe. I ended up having to leave dinner a little bit early to go back to the airport so I could head out. But overall, it was an excellent weekend. And, 18th place, knowing the person that won, he was a deserving champion, really nice guy. And overall, a super fun event. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I was really excited to make it, and if you didn't make it all the way to the end, leave hashtag Black Lotus in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments section down below. Hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, let me know as well, because going to these sorts of events, being able to meet all of the folks that I was able to meet there, and just have a great experience was a lot of fun. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.